So, let us get back to this question, the philosophical side of our introduction. So, what are minds essentially? So, if you remember the Aristotle, the view from Aristotle, it said that our thoughts are a reflection of what is out there. If I see an apple, it's, or if I think of an apple, it's because there is an apple out there, and my thought is in the image of that apple that out there essentially. The diametrically opposite view was given to us by Kant much later. He said that what is out there is a reflection of our thoughts, that what we think is out there is what we think is out there. Now, you see there is a chasm, there is a gap that you can never cross, because what you think is out there is only what you are thinking is out there, what is really out there. So, you see a person, person sitting here. So, I think there is a person sitting here essentially. So, I have this concept of people, I have concepts of boys, girls, man, woman, all kinds of concepts, trees, chairs. So, that is how I think about the world, and it is out there. So, I also have concepts about clouds, and you see an image of something in the clouds, you see a dog in the clouds, or something else. What is out there really is a question we want to start with, and then we have seen already that the notion of the mind has come about. The people understood that there is something called the mind gradually over a period of time, and they realize that what they are thinking about is not in direct correspondence with what is out there. But now what we want to discuss is that it is a necessity, that if you have to have an intelligent agent, we have to have a mind which can represent the world in a way that it can manage the representation effectively. So, that is a question I am driving at today. So, let us start with the basic question as to what is reality. Of course, we live in a world, we are also part of this world, but what is the objective reality? If you wanted to create a model of the world, how would I do it? What is really out there? Any suggestions? You are talking about reality. So, you are saying that reality is, as we see, a collection of situations which we can manipulate. No, but simpler things like people. Here is this young man sitting over there. Is he real, or what is a young man? What is a human being? Okay, so let us take a scientific in quotes point of view, the physics point of view. Everything in the physical world is made up of a small number of fundamental particles. So, when I say a small number of fundamental particles, I mean that the number of different particles are small. It is not that the number of particles is small, the different types is small essentially. So, depending on what theory you are following. So, the simplest one could follow the Bohr atom model, for example, an atom is made up of protons and neutrons and electrons, and everything else in the world is made up of these three kind of things essentially. So, physicists of course have been struggling to figure out what the world is made up of, but let us take it for granted that it is some fundamental particle. It could be something smaller than proton and neutron, but everything is there, and these particles, they obey some laws of physics. So, the laws of physics are sufficient to explain what is happening in the world out there. So, that is the first assumption that we will work with, and it is not something that you can dispute, because then you are saying the physics is wrong essentially. So, like Penrose was saying that the physics of the brain we do not understand, then you would be saying that we do not understand the physics of this world essentially. So, the physicists believe that we do not know what that. So, there is a string theory, then there are neutrinos and gluons and that kind of stuff, but there is something out there and they all behave according to the laws of physics which we are trying to discover, but they behave according to these laws, and therefore, everything can be explained according to these laws. So, that is enough to understand the world in some sense. So, we are talking about people. What is a person? So, human adult is made up of about 10 raised to 27 atoms. I do not know whether you can visualize the number 10 raised to 27, but you should try. It is a huge number. So, we can think of a person or person not in the social sense, but in the physical sense. A human body is made up of about 10 raised to 27 atoms. So, this young man sitting over there is just a collection of 10 raised to 27 atoms, which for some reason decide to stick together, and that reason is given by the laws of physics. It can be explained by the laws of physics, and of course, we may couch it in different terms. We may talk about biology or chemistry and so on, but deep down they obey these laws of physics which the fundamental particles obey essentially. So, we had mentioned earlier that there are two views of the world. One is the materialist view, which says that there is only matter, and the other is the idealism view, which says that there is no matter essentially. So, which is why in the last slide I had said that if there are fundamental particles, because some people believe that it is all energy or something out there essentially. But that let us not get into that kind of a thing. So, we are trying to understand the world, we are trying to model the world, we are trying to. Why do we want to do that? Because an intelligent agent, and we discussed this in the early lectures, should be able to operate in a meaningful manner in the world, do something useful for itself and achieve its goals and learn and that kind of stuff. So, it needs to represent the world out there, but what is the world out there is the question we are asking. So, human being is about 10 raised to 27 atoms, and these 10 raised to 27 atoms are continuously interacting with zillions of other atoms out there. We breathe, we eat, we have sound waves impinging upon us, which are also made up of particles, oscillating particles, and so on and so forth essentially. So, if we try to talk about reality in these terms like a physicist, can we ever make sense of this world out there? And when I say make sense of this world, as a I mean in the practical sense, as an intelligent agent in some environment trying to do useful things essentially. So, can we ever hope to write down equations for them and solve them, even if we know the equations, and what would we get if we solve them essentially? Their trajectories or their location, or how does that help us? That atom number 259 is moving in this direction, or does not help. So, if we want to interact with the world, we need to have our own level of representation, and this is what I am going to be driving at today. The world that we interact with, like Kant said, is a world in our mind essentially. So, we have already said that the world around us and including us operates according to and can in principle be explained by the fundamental laws of physics. Nothing else is really needed, but it is too big for us to work with, because the amount of information we would have to use would be too much essentially. What we do is that we create our own worlds in our minds, and it is only our creation that is meaningful to us essentially. So, coming back to the example of a person, I do not think of a person as an ensemble of 10 raised to 27 atoms behaving in some concerted fashion. I think of it as a single entity, a person who is sitting on a single entity called a chair, or eating a single entity which is I call a dosa. So, masala dosa for example, I think of it as one thing essentially. Of course, it is not one thing, it is made up of so many things and so many processes, and I do not want to get into that at all. So, we create levels of abstraction at which we represent things and reason at those levels of abstractions. So, we should also keep in mind Newell and Simon's physical symbol system hypothesis. is that we can create symbol systems and manipulate those symbols, that is enough for us to reason about the world in an intelligent fashion essentially. So, Douglas Hofstadter, who I will talk about again in a moment, has a different notion of a symbol which we will not pursue very much here. He talks about how the mind creates symbol, how the brain creates these same symbols that we are talking about. It stands for a person and so on and so forth. So, when I was talking about a symbol, I said something which was perceptible. So, for example, I write the name of a person, I can read it essentially, or I can type it in a word processor and things like that. But Hofstadter also talks about symbol processing in the human brain, that the human brain creates symbols, and what are these symbols? These are kind of concerted patterns of activity in thousands of neurons. So, we will not go into more detail than that, but somehow neurons act in concert with each other in a manner which we are inspecting ourselves think of as symbols, that we are reasoning with symbols. So, this kind of idea has been exploited in movies. Of course, movies do not necessarily depict reality. So, again coming back to the Matrix. So, if those of you who have seen Matrix would remember that its main character called Neo. In Neo's mind, Neo was a software engineer working in New York City, and that is how the movie begins. But in reality, whatever that means, Neo is in some cell in some human battery which the machines have constructed to extract energy out of him. So, which is a complicated sequence which we have to sort of watch the movie carefully to understand that when eventually that something is pulled out of his brain, he really finds himself in some very un-New York like place, inside some cell where he is just unit of a large battery or something like that. The important thing that I am trying to say is that it uses this idea that the world we live in is actually in our minds out there essentially, which is why of course, sometimes people can hallucinate, they imagine something what is not out there, because their minds are sort of not in sync with, again let me use the word reality out there. But there is this big chasm that we do not know what is reality, we only know what we know essentially. Inception is another film in which you would not know whether you are dreaming or whether you are in some real world. And this is what the physical system hypothesis says, that if you can create a level of representation and reason at that level, that should be enough for creating intelligent systems. This is a very dense slide that I have put in. We are not going to go through this slide, it is just to illustrate the levels of scale at which our concepts exist. Remember that in the end everything is made up of ensembles of these fundamental particles, but then we talk of people, we will talk of a football field, we talk of a planet, all these are at different levels of scale. There is a very nice movie, I do not know how many of you have seen it, called Powers of 10, which is available on the web, and there is a link I have given here, which essentially zooms out of a level in which a couple is seen in a park and goes to the very topmost level here, which you can see 10 raised to 26 meters, and then zooms down back and goes to the bottommost level, which is 10 raised to minus 17 meters and things like that. So, at different levels you see the world with a different perspective. So, just some examples, for example, mustard seed is about 1 millimeter thick, whereas the distance from Chennai to Pune is about 1000 or 1100 kilometers. So, in this powers of 10, you keep magnifying the image or reducing the image by powers of 10 every time, and then you sort of keep diving in deeper and so on and so forth. So, you can see at the topmost level there are very things that we cannot, I mean our mind boggles to talk about something like 10 billion light years. First of all, you have to imagine what is a light year, or remember what is a light year. It is a distance covered by light in 1 year, and we do not even think of light having speed. I mean, I just see you and you raise your hand and I see it instantaneously. Where is the question of speed? We do not even have a notion of speed. Of course, nowadays we have, thanks to Einstein and all these people, but light travels at a finite speed, and we do not realize it, because it is so fast for all of us here that everything happens instantaneously. We do not suffer from this effects of relativity and things like that. But 10 billion light years, how much would the light travel in 10 billion years? I mean, we can't even think of these kind of things essentially, or at the very extreme end, 10 raised to minus 17 meters, where you have quarks and gluons and so on and so forth. So, the world as we think of nowadays exists at these very different scales of things. That is at one level. At another level, it is all just collections of fundamental particles, which we have already agreed that we cannot deal with at that level. That is why we think of these different scales essentially. Okay. So, our perceptible universe is a small subset of this scale essentially. So, the largest thing we can see is maybe about a kilometer across. So, like the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco or something like that, and the smallest thing is maybe a mustard seed, or maybe some people can see pollen, and there is rays of light and you can see dust particles, some of them may be 0.1 millimeter across. So, we can perhaps think about things at this level of scale essentially. So, the human mind, that is what I am trying to get at. The human mind has evolved to create concepts at these scales essentially. So, we tend to think of objects in these scales, that is why we are comfortable with this. We are not even comfortable talking about how far the planet Jupiter is from here, because we cannot even imagine that kind of a thing. I mean, at least you have not evolved to imagine that kind of a thing. And to reason at different levels, we have created these different disciplines. So, we become specialists in biology or geography or astrophysics or anything, but each discipline operates in its own level of scale. Social sciences operate at some level where we are talking about collections of human beings. Remember, each human being is a collection of 10 raised to 27 particles. So, social science in some sense is talking about collections of 10 raised to 27 particles, but we do not obviously think in terms of fundamental particles any longer, and we have these different disciplines essentially. So, Hofstadter, so remember this mind body problem which Descartes was grappling with, that if there is this world of the mind which is reasoning about the real physical world out there, the body, how do the two things interact essentially. Now, the physics, we say we have laws of physics at the fundamental particle level, and if you know that, you know how the rest of the system is behaving essentially. But Hofstadter says that we have to introduce a notion of what he calls as downward causality, which means the causality is from a higher level to a lower level. Even though the laws of physics can explain going from particle level to ensembles of particle level, he says that is not useful for us. We have to think about how. So, for example, if I want to drink a cup of tea, then I am thinking at a level about cup of tea and so on and so forth, and this level of thinking which is happening with these concepts at this level of abstraction is eventually driving at one level, you might say my muscles or my nerve cells or something. At even lower level, you might say the very fundamental particles which make up my hand, for example, in such a manner that my hand eventually reaches out for that cup of tea and pick it up and take a sip from it essentially. So, the causality is from our level of reasoning to the lower level where things are actually happening. Now, physics of course, does not have a notion of causality. That is why Kant, even when he was talking about human categories, was saying that space and causality are given to us, that we accept, we have to start working with those things essentially. So, So, these things are called epiphenomena. So, things like pressure for example, in a balloon, we talk of pressure, but what is really happening that lower level activities, molecules of different kinds of molecules in air, nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, everything, they are moving around randomly and impinging upon the surface of the inner surface of the balloon, and this cumulative activity or the epiphenomenon of pressure is felt essentially. Likewise, in our human brains there are these billions of neurons which are firing away in some fashion. We do not tend to think of our brain in that fashion. I tend to think of my brain in saying, oh, I want to have this cup of tea, which is operating at a very higher level essentially. So, can a machine operate at the epiphenomena level like this, and that we feel is necessary for machines to be intelligent.